Harry. Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm here to talk about the greenhouse gas emissions today. I work for the Ministry for the Environment and I'm involved in the compilation of the inventory, specifically the land use and forestry sector, but also in the summary information, etc. So today I'm going to give you a bit of context on what it is that we do in the inventory program. So we produce this annual inventory amongst other reports, and I'll present the data from the most recently published one, which unfortunately John has just also presented to you, but never mind, we didn't decide what was going to be in each other's presentations. I'll also give a sectoral breakdown, and we'll look at the projections, and I'll spend a little bit of time on how we do our international accounting, because it's a little bit different from the inventory. So accounting rules that sit over that mean that things are not quite what you might expect. So why we inventory our greenhouse gases? Well, we have to do this to meet our international reporting obligations under the Climate Change Convention. So we produce this annual inventory, a 2-yearly biennial report, and a national communication which goes 4 yearly. These reports all have slightly different focus. The annual inventory is historic. It's up until a period before the inventory is published. So we're about to publish our 2017 inventory later this week. The biennial report has a focus on tracking against targets, and the national communication is a bit more about government policies and what we're doing about climate change. The importance of these inventories is also to track progress against our emissions reduction targets under the Kyoto Protocol, that's up to 2020, and then post-2020 under the Paris Agreement. New Zealand operates a distributed model. The Ministry for the Environment is the inventory agency, but we also have the Ministry for Primary Industries, Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, as well as the Environmental Protection Authority, are all involved in the inventory compilation. So the data that I'm presenting here today, by and large, is from these 3 publications that I've just mentioned. And I've already talked about that. These are reporting requirements for Annex 1 parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that's just the developed nations. So there's about 43, well there is 43 out of the 197 parties to the convention that mandatorily have to produce these reports. The reports are also subject to international expert review. So here's New Zealand's emissions profile as at 2016, and for the 2016 year. The non-carbon dioxide gases get converted to their CO2 equivalent using the global warming potential as published in the IPCC assessment report number 4 at the moment. That's a UNFCCC reporting requirement. So that's already captured in those estimates. You can see that agriculture, as John's already shown us, is the biggest of our gross emissions. Our gross emissions are sitting to the right of the 0 line there. So that's agriculture and energy, they're the big ones. And then on the left of the line, you'll see the land use and forestry sector. So that's a net sink and removes that much of the CO2 from the atmosphere, and along the top there is the kilotons of CO2 equivalents on that graph. And here's the graph, the same graph that John showed you again with those sectors, the gross emissions on the top. If you, that's a stacked graph, so they're just adding to each other. You see again the increase in agriculture hasn't been quite the same as it has in energy. And the what I've added in there is I've added in the line that shows the amount of removals that we're getting out of our forests and land use. That's got the year along the X and the kilotons of CO2 equivalents on the Y there. I'm going to show a few graphs like this so that they all look the same as this one. I won't repeat John's percentages of change, but yeah. So when we add all the gross emissions up there above the line, they come to that top line where we've got that 19.6% increase since 1990 in the 2016 inventory. And then if you add all the sectors together, including the land use and forestry, that's where you get the net emissions line, which sits below that, and that shows that we're having there's been a bigger increase since 1990 of 54.2%. The key driver of the increase in gross emissions has been fuel from transport and nitrous oxide in agriculture. They're the two big drivers of that increase since 1990. There has been an increase in methane and dairy, but that's been offset relatively, not quite offset, but by the reduction in sheep over the period. The big change in the net emissions is driven by the harvest in our plantation forests. We're harvesting a lot more right now over in this decade and the next than we were in 1990, and that's simply a factor of the age class profile of those forests. So now I'm going to talk about projections, so what we're looking at over the next little while. These are the data that I'm presenting are published in our 7th National Communication and 3rd Biennial Report, and those were published in December 2017. So these do not take account of the changes that we've seen since the government changed late 2017. But they don't include the Billion Trees program, the increased spending on public transport, the cycling and walking package, and there's a low emissions vehicle package as well that's been released. So there are various variables and assumptions used to calculate these projections, and they're based on the best data available at the time, but they are inherently uncertain. Economic variables such as oil price and assumed carbon price have significant effects on projected emissions and removals. In addition, seasonal changes, especially variations in rainfall, can affect agricultural emissions as well as electricity generation emissions. So this is just a list of a summary of the key variables that are used for these projections. And this is a slide showing the government priorities, policies at that time when this was published. So New Zealand ETS stars there for all but the agriculture sector, and the other various policies. There's several from ECA on energy. So there's some RMA instruments at work here with the NPS for freshwater management influencing agricultural emissions, and the National Environmental Standards for air quality as well. And for land use and forestry, a number of funding programs as well as the NZ ETS are having impact there. So this is a graph showing the gross emissions and how it's rising, or the projected rise to 2030. The small dots are without measures, and the dashed line is what we estimate those emissions will look like with those measures in place. So we're expecting it to have those policies and measures to have some impact on our emissions out to 2030. When you compare that projection to 2030 with the 2005 level, it's the current policies and measures as at 2017 are projected to give us a 6% drop from 2005. And if you remember, the target is 30% below 2005. For net emissions, the projected increase is projected rise is going to continue, so that trend is going to continue as it has done over the last few years, as a lot of those production forests come on stream for harvest, and that's from the planting boom that happened in the the one that we're seeing now is in the 80s and then moves into the 90s. So we're not going to see that drop away again until the mid-2030s. And then there's the two graphs together there showing you what's happening with net and gross emissions out to 2030. The decreasing trend in gross emissions to 2030 is due to a greater amount of land use change from agriculture to forestry that's projected, and reduced energy use combined with less carbon intensive fuels used for energy production, and more sustainable farm management practices. And that difference between the gross and the net really does highlight the issues we have with the harvest that's coming on stream, is on stream now and going to continue. So we've got some challenges here. This is a breakdown of those projections by sector. And what's perhaps a little bit confusing there is that we've split away transport from energy. So that's so we can see that the projections for agriculture sector are staying pretty even, and they're going to increase in the transport sector. These projections are produced by a cross-government technical group, which is led by the Ministry for the Environment, but includes the key players in the sectors, which is, for these at least, MPI and Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment for the energy sector. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about accounting for targets, because when you look at those emissions projections, you can see that we really are not on track to get to that 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. But there are some factors that come into the accounting that make it not so perhaps so straightforward. So up to 2020, New Zealand is continuing to account for its emissions reduction target, applying the Kyoto Protocol framework of rules. And that's an unconditional target to reduce emissions to 5% below 1990 levels by 2020, and then the Paris Agreement 30% below 2005. And we have a long-term target currently gazetted at reducing 50% of 1990 emissions by 2050. So while we use the gross emissions estimates to set our targets, we can meet them using some of our forestry and land use removals, as well as international units. So this is a graph that you can see on the Ministry for the Environment website, and what I want to show you here is how the target is set. So you see that the target for CP1 for each of those commitment periods is that orange line. That's our carbon budget sitting below. You can see those the graphs that I've already been showing you with the gross emissions and the net emissions lines, and then in the green is what we can get how much of our forestry and land use sector we can use to offset our emissions and meet our targets. So when you look at the CP1 period, 2008 to 2012, you can see that we virtually met that. Well, we met it with our forestry units. But during that time, our market was open to international units. So in the second commitment period, we didn't take a target under the Kyoto Protocol, we took it under the Convention, which means we lost access to markets. So all our units that are sitting in our registry were earned or purchased in the 08 to 12 period. And then, so you can see that the difference between the green line and the orange line, the abatement task is between the blue line and the orange line, but you can see how much we're getting out of forestry if you go down to the green line. And then you can see the white bits between that. That's our abatement task after we've achieved what we've achieved from forestry. So you can see how important forestry's been in CP1 and CP2. But look at the Paris Agreement period, you know, we're not going to get much at all. That's because our rules have changed and how we're going to account for forestry in that period for one reason, and it's the historic, there's been such a lack of afforestation since the 1990s. That's just basically a legacy that we're seeing there. So, but when you hear the government, it will say that we are on track to meet our 2020 target, and you would look at that and go, how on earth can you do that? And I can show you how we do it. This is our latest net position. This is also available on the website. So you can see that our gross emissions are projected to be this in the dark blue, and then our carbon budget sits there in the lighter blue on the other side. That's what so that's what we get. That's what we're trying to get to. Then we can see our forestry removals sit on top of that, so they give us that much abatement. And then we've got that surplus from CP1, which is 123 odd million units are sitting there. So that's how we're going to meet our CP2 target, is with mostly with forestry units and with these surplus units. So I'll just finish with this graph again. So that shows a couple of things. One of the important things for us to meet any of our future targets is really we need to start getting that gross emission line down. And the other thing is the importance of international units if we can't do that. And that's one outcome of the latest conference of the parties that was held in Poland, is no agreement got reached on international units. So essentially, we really do need to find some emissions reductions in our gross emissions, and also these projections, as I've said before, don't include the impact of the billion trees and other policies that have been brought in over the last year with the change of government. So we will see some changes in those projections, but you might have to wait till December this year for our next publication, our next biennial report, to see the impact of that. And that's about it from me. Ngā mihi nui.